All right, shows 1:02 on my clock here. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. For those of you that may not know me, my name is Christopher Stevens. I'm one of the assistant deputy directors here in the Division of Financial Assistance up at the State Water Board. And so one of my responsibilities is to oversee the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So again, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I know it's a Friday afternoon and we're just a few days away from Thanksgiving. I know everybody's probably thinking about their Thanksgiving meal, and so I really appreciate you joining us on a Friday afternoon to talk about what isn't nearly as exciting as Thanksgiving, but hopefully this will be beneficial to you nonetheless. So just a kind of quick word about the order of the day here. So I've got about 20 slides or so I'm going to go through to provide some information to you that's relevant to the intended use plans, which are the business plans for the state revolving fund programs, both the Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF. And then we're going to open it up whatever time is left. Hopefully that won't take me, probably less than an hour, I would imagine. To run through those slides, and whatever time we have left, then we're going to open it up for discussion, questions. Didn't really have a real rigid agenda here. The information I'm going to present today is quite a bit of depth to it. I apologize for that. I'm going to gloss over quite a few details that are associated with the SRF programs. This has been a very interesting year for both the SRF programs. No doubt many of you have heard about the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed last year that is going to provide quite a bit of money over the next 5 years for the SRF programs. And no doubt that's one of the reasons that you're listening in today and that you're interested in the SRF programs in general. Been a bit, like I say, been an interesting year. Created quite a few challenges for us to put together the intended use plans for this year. Normally, we would take those plans to the State Water Board for approval in June. That's typically when we do it. Because of the extra money and the additional objectives associated with some of that money, we weren't able to get to the board until October 3rd. Hopefully you're aware that that's when the board approved this year's IUPs. Of course, time marches on, and so next year we do the intended use plans on a yearly basis, and so next year we will have another intended use plan that we hope will go to the board in June on a normal schedule. But because we were delayed this year in getting approval, obviously that sort of crunched the amount of time. We will start preparing next year's IUPs. Typically, we start that in January. And so one of the things that we wanted to do this year, the reason for this listening session is kind of give people a chance to give us some feedback on the IUP this year. This listening session is not going to necessarily go into all of the ground that the IUPs cover. The main thing that we wanted to talk about today, that I'm going to talk about today, is the effect of the bipartisan infrastructure law on the loan capacity for the Clean Water SRF program, and to a certain extent, the Drinking Water SRF program, and really delve into that aspect of the intended use plans. Now, one quick note here while I think about it. So I will talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law. Officially, it's known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So you may see that name thrown about, or I may use that here and there. Typically, I will use the bipartisan infrastructure law. I may call it the bill occasionally. So it's not some individual named bill. That's sort of the shorthand acronym of how people typically refer to it. But you may also see IIJA, or like I say, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So that's all the same thing. And usually I will talk about it as the bipartisan infrastructure law. So before I get into slides two, I want to thank, I've got a number of very talented staff that are helping me out today. And so I just wanted to acknowledge them and introduce them very briefly. Mike Downey, who's one of the supervising engineers here. He's also responsible for overseeing the SRF programs. Bob Pontareri is one of our senior engineers, a very seasoned senior engineer with the programs. Beth Brown, one of our staff engineers, is here supporting us. Josh Zeese from our administrative section is also here today, one of the administrative managers, very influential in running the SRF programs. Elnaz Nasai is also here, a staff person that is helping me today. All very talented folks that I'm very happy to have their support. So Mike, if we could go to the next slide there. That's just kind of a rundown of what I'm going to talk about. Again, I'm mostly going to focus on the ability of the SRF programs to provide loans. And there's a lot of other ground that the intended use plans cover, certainly for disadvantaged communities. With the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's money for emerging contaminants, lead service lines. I'm not really going to delve into those topics. The main purpose of the listening session today is to talk about the loan capacity and the effect of the bipartisan infrastructure law on California's ability to loan funds through the SRF programs. So I'm going to go in quite a bit of depth and essentially walk you through the thought process of how we come up with those recommendations to the board for how much we should loan on a yearly basis. And that's going to take a little bit of technical knowledge, and I'm going to try to keep it as plain English in layman's terms as much as I can. But hopefully at the end, if you have questions about that, I can certainly clarify that for you. So if we could go to the first slide there. Excuse me. So just let's start out with some basic here. Let's have a quick reminder about what the intended use plan is. As I say, that's the business plan. There is an IUP for the clean water SRF and one for the drinking water SRF. So those are the business plans for the SRF programs. But they also serve as a vehicle for us to provide additional funding, state funding, that is very closely aligned with the purposes and eligibilities of those SRF programs. So when you look at the Clean Water SRF IUP, you'll see in there, references to general fund appropriations. We've had quite a bit of general fund appropriation over the last couple of years with the state budget surplus. Historically, there have been bond measures related to water that have been approved, and so the IUPs will also speak to that and explain how we coordinate the SRF funding with the bond funding. For many years, we've had an administrative fee and a small community grant fee, where we take some of the interest that is paid on the SRF loans and then use that for either administering the SRF programs or in providing grants to small disadvantaged communities. Part of the practical aspect of the IUP is that that's part of the application that we submit to US EPA on an annual basis, so that we can get grants from US EPA that are appropriated by Congress. All the states do this. All the states are required to prepare intended use plans for the SRF program. So nothing unique to California. And of course, like I say, this year we had the bipartisan infrastructure law. So if you looked at the IUPs for the two SRF programs, you also saw that there were supplemental IUPs. As I say, there's supplemental funding for emerging contaminants and supplemental funding for lead service line replacements. And then again, on another practical basis here, we establish fundable lists of projects. So these are the projects that the board is intending to fund in a given fiscal year. Those are the projects that are eligible to receive, that can receive funding, whether that's loan funds or loan forgiveness funds or grant funds. There's kind of two different pathways there. Loan projects for the Clean Water SRF go through a scoring process in order to get on the fundable list. Loan projects for the Drinking Water SRF go through a ranking process to get on the fundable list. And then for small disadvantaged communities, a slightly different pathway. When they don't go through any sort of scoring or ranking process, they need to submit a complete application to get on the fundable list. And they can do that at any time. And the scoring and the ranking is done annually. So during the year, there's no chance for somebody to get on the Clean Water SRF. Nobody that's asking for loan funds to get on the fundable list, either for the Clean Water SRF or Drinking Water SRF. And sorry, go back there. One last point. So again, the purpose of today's listening session is to kind of walk you through this process of how we develop, do the fundable list, do the scoring and ranking, and develop the fundable list for the loan projects, and give you an opportunity to give us some feedback on what you think next year ought to involve. So let's go to the next slide there. And then, oh, sorry, one other kind of housekeeping thing is, if you do have questions, go ahead and put those in the chat as I'm talking, and then at the end we'll go through those, and however much time we have, we'll go through those, and then I'll also give you an email address where you can send follow-up comments to us as well at the end. So go to the next slide there, Mike. So let's start with some basics here. And if I'm telling you things that you already know, I apologize for that. I didn't want to make any assumptions that folks are familiar with the SRF funds necessarily. So I'm going to start out with some very basic information here, and then I'm going to build on that, and it's going to get more complex as we go forward. But the SRF funds are largely loan programs. So they are, in essence, they act as infrastructure banks. And so the way any bank works is a certain amount of money is put into the bank. In this case, it's a combination of federal funds that come to us from EPA and some state funds that are required to be contributed to match those federal funds. So the ratio is, for every $5 federal dollars that we get, the state has to contribute $1. And so that gets put into this particular graphic is related to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, but the Drinking Water SRF operates essentially the same way. It's an infrastructure bank. That money is then loaned out. You can see on the right-hand side, low interest loans are loaned out to public entities in most cases, and projects are done, and then loan repayments come back to the Clean Water SRF, and then they get loaned out again. The other thing that the Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF can do is it can also go into the municipal bond market, and it can borrow money. And so we have sold bonds. That's what they call that kind of a loan. We have sold bonds on at least 4 occasions, for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and once for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And so part of that money in the SRF program can be used to pay the cost of borrowing that money in the municipal bond market. And so we borrow the money just as other folks borrow the money from the Clean Water SRF. We borrow the money from bond people that buy bonds, mutual fund companies, insurance companies, pension funds, so those sorts of folks, and then we pay that money back to them over time. And then you can see just down in the right-hand corner, just to give you a sense of scale, since the beginning of the California Clean Water SRF, we've loaned out about $14 billion in funds, and for the California Drinking Water SRF, about $4.5 billion in funds. So go to the next slide there, Meg. So let's talk in a little bit more detail about that idea of where the money comes from and what the significance of that money is. So I'm going to use this word capitalization. Maybe some of you have heard that word. It's kind of a technical word. At the foundation of our ability to loan money out is how much capital has been put into the program. So again, that's kind of a fancy word. Really what that means is how much money has been put into the program and how much money stays in the program. So that's the federal grants that I talked about, as well as the state matching funds. And then we loan that money out and it earns interest. There's earnings on that. Again, that's kind of a technical word for financial folks, but that's really amounts to largely the interest that is paid by the folks that borrow money from the SRF programs. Some of our money sits in the state treasury and it does earn some interest by doing that. Over the past few years, that hasn't been very much, but with increasing interest rates, that probably will start to increase here. Now, one of the key things to understand about this is the perpetuity rule. So capital, or the amount of money that goes into the program and stays in the program, that money has to be maintained in perpetuity. So at the end of the day, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, however long, all that money that's been contributed by the federal government and the state government has to remain there. EPA, when they set up the program, when the federal government set up the program, they said, you can loan the money out under one condition. The one primary condition is that the loans have to be below market. The states get to decide that, what constitutes below market. In our case, we charge for the clean water SRF and the drinking water SRF, basically half of the state's general obligation borrowing rate. And that can include zero interest. So there's been some money loaned out at zero interest, as well as at interest. And as I talked about in the previous slide, we can go and borrow money in the municipal bond market. And the way that we do that, the way that we pay for that cost, because we borrow at a higher interest rate than we loan the money out to others. So the way to pay for that difference is with the earnings. So you put those three things together, that all the capital you can't touch the capital, but you can use the earnings to pay for the cost of borrowing capital. That is really what determines the capacity for us to make loans overall. So I put all that together, and the last bullet there is annual loan capacity. So I just want to clarify here, because I think there has been some confusion among stakeholders that we're not using all the capacity and that we should go and sell bonds in order to increase our capacity. So I just want to clarify that that capacity calculation that we do for the SRF programs, it includes all the capital that we've received to date, plus it includes future capital contributions. We make some assumptions that we're going to continue to get capitalization grants and matching funds from the state government. It is based on the past and estimated future earnings. And it assumes that we will sell bonds on a regular basis. And so we have to make certain assumptions about the cost of that, what interest rates are going to be. And then we take out, I did mention earlier that there are fees that we take out of the interest rate for admin and disadvantaged communities. So all of those things are included in that loan capacity calculation. So go to the next slide, Mike. Okay, so let's delve a little bit more deeply into the capitalization grants that we get from US EPA. So both programs have gotten grants on a yearly basis. For the clean water SRF, that goes back to 1989. For the drinking water SRF, I think they received their first a grant in 1997 or thereabouts. And so one of the things that's important to recognize about the capitalization grants is that not all of the money stays in the program. Remember, I talked about capital is the amount of money that stays in the program. When we get a grant from EPA, some of it is used for set-asides in the case of the drinking water SRF. That money does not stay in the program. It gets used one time and then it's gone. For the clean water SRF, there is also an administrative allowance, and there's also a technical assistance allowance. Those funds do not stay in the program. They're used one time and then they're gone. And then both programs also allow for loan forgiveness. PF stands for principal forgiveness. So that is in essence a grant. And again, that money does not stay in the program. It gets used one time and then it's gone. It's not loaned out and then repaid and then loaned out again. So for both programs, in the case of the clean water SRF, only about half of the money actually stays in the program and is used for that loan capacity calculation. For the drinking water SRF, it's only about 25% actually stays in the program. So go to the next slide then, Ray. So let's talk in a little bit more detail about the bipartisan infrastructure law. So two things happened with the bipartisan infrastructure law. So PF stands for principal forgiveness, loan forgiveness. So two things happened with the bipartisan infrastructure law. And this gets a little technical, I apologize for that. Congress appropriated money through the bipartisan infrastructure law. So that's money that they have appropriated to the states, and there's no further action other than we have to apply for EPA. We have to apply to EPA on a yearly basis to get the money over the next 5 years, but it's been appropriated. Congress also authorized funding in future years for the SRF programs, and that is part of the annual budget. And so I'm going to first talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law appropriations. So these are funds that we know we will get in the future as long as we prepare an IUP and submit the grant application on a yearly basis to EPA. Now, you may have seen somewhere along the line that California is going to get $3.3 or $3.4 billion from the bipartisan infrastructure law. So this is where that number comes from. So you can see on the left-hand side, the Clean Water SRF program, about $850 million in total appropriations from the bill. On the drinking water side, a little over $2.5 billion for the drinking water SRF program. So again, remember that not all of that money is going to go towards making loans. A significant amount of it is going to go to other purposes. So let's look at the breakdown of that. What's going to go to loans are the sections in blue, the $353 million on the clean water side and about $557 million on the drinking water side. All of the rest of those funds are going to be used one time and only one time. And so you can see part of the money is for emerging contaminants, part of the money is for set-asides or administrative allowances, part of it is for principal forgiveness, for loan forgiveness. And so again, only in the case of the clean water program, I think it's slightly more than 40% is going to go towards loans. On the drinking water side, it's around 20%, 22%, something like that, if I remember right. So let's go to the next slide here, Mike. So the other thing I mentioned was that Congress authorized money to be appropriated in future fiscal years. And you may have seen, if you add these two numbers up here and what has been, they increased the authorizations from what was previously authorized quite a bit for both SRF programs. And if you look at those numbers, that's the total number in blue there. On the left-hand side for the Clean Water SRF, it's about $1.5 billion over 5 years. On the Drinking Water SRF, it's about $1.7 billion. So that mental math there is about $3.2 billion in total. If you add that to the 3.4, you may have seen a number somewhere along the lines of California getting over $6 billion in money as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law. That's where that number comes from. However, as I say, that money that we're talking about on this slide is authorized. It has to be appropriated on a yearly basis. So what happened this fiscal year, federal fiscal year 2022, was Congress, number one, did not appropriate what was authorized. It appropriated quite a bit less, only about 30% of what was authorized on a yearly basis. In addition to that, Congress directed 30 to 35% of what was appropriated for each of those programs. They directed it to specific projects, and the result of that was that money didn't go to the SRFs. They went to projects that were specifically identified and named by Congress to go to those projects. So if one were to take that experience this year and extrapolate that over the next 5 years, which is what we did as part of this year's IUP, the numbers that we are expecting, and they can increase because Congress may actually appropriate money at the fully authorized level in future years. I'm not saying that this is what's going to happen over the next 5 years, but this is our current estimate, is for the Clean Water SRF. We're estimating total grants about $468 million. For the Drinking Water SRF, about $355 million. And again, remember that not all of that money is going to go towards loans. So for the Clean Water SRF, we're estimating about $250 million for loans, and for the Drinking Water SRF, around $89 million for loans. That would be money that stays in the program. So go to the next slide there, Mike. So if we put those two numbers together and calculate how much money is going to go towards loans for each of the SRF programs, that's the blue bars there in this graph. And then compare that to, again, we were estimating, counting on continuing to get capitalization grants before the bipartisan infrastructure law came along. That's the orange bars there. If we were to compare how much is going to go to loans as a result of the bill and how much before we got the bill, that's the comparison there. You can see on the Clean Water SRF, both of them are an increase, so no question about that. More money is going to go into the program and stay into the program to contribute to that loan capacity. But it's not quite as dramatic as 6 times more than was going there previously. On the clean water side, it's about double. On the drinking water side, yes, it's a fairly significant boost there. And so that just gives you a sense of what the actual impact to the loan capacity is from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And then the next slide, we'll put that in even more context. Go to the next slide there, Mike. So again, we've calculated the capacity of both SRF programs to make loans. And I talked about this on an earlier slide, what goes into that calculation. Largely it's driven by the amount of capital that goes into the program. And so when this slide is intended to show the impact of that extra money that is going to come as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law and what effect that has on the calculated capacity of, in this particular case, the Clean Water SRF very similar results for the drinking water SRF, but use this just as an example. You can see in the blue part of the bars there, that's all the capital that we've received in the past that is included in the capacity calculation. The orange part of the bar is all of the money that we were assuming that we would get in the future, that we were estimating we would get in the future. And so on the left-hand side, you can see here's the calculation that we did before bill, and about $600 million was our calculated capacity. Again, based on what happened with the appropriation this year and our projections for future years, that's the middle bar there. You can see somewhat of an increase in the loan capacity of the SRF program, but not a very dramatic increase. The bar on the right-hand side, maximum capitalization with bill, that's our calculation based on if Congress did in fact appropriate all of the funds that they had authorized. Yeah, that would have a noticeable increase in the overall loan capacity of the Clean Water SRF. And just so one thing to point out here is, part of that orange bar, as you can see, it's even across there. So part of the capitalization that we were getting, that we're counting on from the bipartisan infrastructure law, we were already counting part of that in our capacity calculation. So it's really the increase as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law that we're counting on. So go to the next slide there, Mike. I did talk about this during the board meeting, and I just wanted to take a second and talk about it again. I think there is perhaps a misapprehension among some stakeholders that California is lagging far behind other states in terms of what has been produced by the Clean Water SRF in particular. I haven't looked at the data for drinking water yet, but these are the results. One of the as I say, one of the main driver of capacity, our ability to make loans from the Clean Water SRF, is the amount of capital in the program. So we get $1 of capital and we loan it out, and that gets repaid, and we loan it out again. That process is done over and over again. And so one of the ways, not the only way, to measure the success of an SRF program is to look at how much has been done with each of the dollars that has been contributed to the program. So this is a comparison between California and several other states that are comparable in the amount of capital that they have. Ohio, Texas, New York, and California are the top 4 states as far as capital contributions for the Clean Water SRF program. And you can see in the red numbers in the middle column there is how much funding has been done for each dollar that has been put into the program. And you can see that the results are very similar to other states. There's about, quick mental math, there's about 45 cents difference between New York and Ohio, and we're right in the middle there. So that's not, as I say, that's not the only measure of success for the SRF programs, but it's kind of a very basic measure of what the SRFs are able to do. That's a basic intent of the SRF program, is to take money and loan it out, and then when it's repaid, to loan it out again to do other projects. So next slide there, Mike. So that's one side of the equation there, which is how much money do we have to loan out? The other side of the equation, in putting the intended use plan together and in developing a fundable list of projects that will be funded by loans, is, well, how much demand do we have for those funds? And so no surprise here. I think stakeholders are very familiar with this. But just to give everyone a sense of what that demand is, about 6 years worth of demand on both programs at this point. And if you look at the table in the orange there, you can see over 20 years that is a very large number. So that's really the underlying problem for both SRF programs, is how to prioritize projects for funding and get the most out of those dollars. So go to the next slide there, Mike. You can see in this slide for the clean water SRF, and the next one will deal with the drinking water SRF. Clean water SRF has been operating above that sustainable, the calculated capacity of the clean water SRF to make loans is about $600 million per year. And you can see from this graph that we've been operating above that level for quite a few years. And a gangbuster year last year. And so that, that came into play. Those of you that are familiar with the Clean Water SRF IUP, staff's initial recommendation in the draft IUP was to not add any projects to the fundable list. I think that caught some people off guard. That was certainly disappointing for us to make that recommendation, but that's kind of what the numbers were telling us. And so as a result of public comment and some discussions with the board members, we modified that and did add some additional projects onto the loan projects onto the fundable list. But and in relation to that, that's one of the reasons that we're having this listening session today, is to go into more depth on this process and help you understand, number one, how we go about this, and number two, to get your feedback on it and support for us. I mean, we're not here to, it's not a program simply for us. I mean, it's for the stakeholders, and so we really value your input on that. I go to the next slide there, Mike. Somewhat similar results for the drinking water SRF, although not quite at the sustainable level. The sustainable level for the drinking water SRF is calculated at $300 million. Again, this past year we had quite a big year, an outsized year. And so that program is more or less at its sustainable level at this point. Of course, depending upon, well, we'll keep monitoring this as we go into the future. Go to the next slide there, Mike. So, as I say, we've got to put these two things together. We've got to put together how much we can fund, given our capital and our ability to fund loans with the SRF programs. We've got to put that together with the folks that want to get a loan from the SRF program, and there are quite a few of them. And so let's just talk a little bit about this process. And there's a lot of details here that I'm glossing over, but essentially what happens is you all, as stakeholders and eligible applicants, submit project applications. That's on the very left-hand side. As I noted earlier, there's two different pathways depending upon what type of applicant you are. Is the project automatically fundable? So small disadvantaged communities don't go through a scoring or a ranking process, but they have to submit a complete application to be on the fundable list. So those folks would answer to that question for them would be yes, and that's how they get on the fundable list. If you go to the right, so other folks have to be scored or ranked. And so we compile a list, we call it a comprehensive list for all the other folks that don't fit into that small disadvantaged community category. And then the folks on that comprehensive list are either scored, there is a scoring process for the Clean Water SRF, or for the drinking water SRF, slightly different process. Those projects are ranked. And then depending upon all those scores and the rankings are compiled, and DFA then selects a cutoff score based on our sustainable lending capacity, or ranks those projects again in comparison to the sustainable lending capacity. And the projects that score or rank above the cutoff then are added to the fundable list. Those projects that aren't added to the fundable list, the answer is no. Those projects, they don't get eliminated. They remain on the comprehensive list, and then they would look forward to getting on the fundable list in the following year. So next slide. So let's kind of get to the heart of today's discussion here. So as I talked about earlier, and hopefully most of you are familiar with, the sequence of events related to the intended use plans this year, particularly the Clean Water SRF. As I say, staff's initial recommendation to the board was to not add any projects to the fundable list. That was further refined, and ultimately we did recommend that a subset of projects based on the cutoff score would be added to the fundable list, in particular to address water resiliency and climate change and those sorts of things. And so, as I say, one of the things that we want to accomplish today is give you all an opportunity to give us some feedback on that, and looking forward to next year, what next year's IUP might look like. And so this is just jotting down a few ideas here. I don't claim that this is an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. You all are much more creative than I am, and probably could come up with much better ideas. But more of an issue on the Clean Water SRF side, as I noted earlier, the Drinking Water SRF is operating at about the sustainable funding level, assuming that we were to continue to operate in a similar way. On the Clean Water SRF, we're a bit over capacity, a bit over our sustainable capacity. And so, the world isn't going to stop tomorrow, but we can't operate that way indefinitely. At some point, there will have to be a drawback. I'm not saying that it's today or tomorrow necessarily, but at some point that number has to be dialed back a little bit. Because part of that, in order to operate that way, we're going to have to sell bonds, and borrowing money costs money. And so that has an effect on our ability to make loans on a year-by-year basis. So just a couple of ideas we jotted down. Again, we could not add projects to the fundable list. If you do the math, in order to get to $600 million on average as quick as possible, we would have to not fund any new projects for, I think, 3 or 4 years. That doesn't seem like a very tenable option to me, but maybe 1 year might be doable. This year we did put a maximum cap on the loan amount for those projects that were added to the fundable list. I think there was only one that was affected by that particular cap. Again, we could prioritize projects to address specific needs, drought or climate change or other objectives. Perhaps we would establish a cutoff score based on something lower than the sustainable loan capacity. So a cutoff score, say, at $300 million or something like that. So go to the next slide there. Almost finished here, and then we can get to some questions and discussion. Excuse me. So what should you take home from my discussion here? I know there's quite a bit of information in there. What are the take-home messages for that? So number one, the capital, again, that's the money that has to stay in the program. That's the money that has to be there at the end of the day, whatever day that is, whether it's next year or 100 years from now. So the loan capacity, how we calculate that, we calculate that on a 20-year time horizon, which is a pretty long time horizon. Another take-home message, I think, is that the Clean Water SRF program is operating above its sustainable loan capacity, has been for several years. And as I say, that can't continue indefinitely. It isn't that it has to stop immediately, but it can't continue indefinitely. At some point, there will have to be dialing that down a little bit. The drinking water SRF is more or less at a sustainable loan capacity, so not really a time-sensitive issue there. The bipartisan infrastructure law was definitely helpful. As I noted earlier, it's more capital for the SRF programs. It was especially helpful for projects that qualify for principal forgiveness. So you saw a lot of principal forgiveness, a lot more principal forgiveness for both SRF programs. There was obviously money for emerging contaminants, which is 100% principal forgiveness. There's money for lead service line replacements. That's all good. Not trying to look that gift horse in the mouth. Another message to take home is that the clean water and drinking water base programs, that's the annual appropriations that we get. Again, as I noted, Congress did increase the authorizations for the programs, but they did not follow through with the appropriations based on those authorizations. So they only appropriated about 30% of what they authorized as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And then, as I noted earlier, again, that was then further reduced by directing some of that spending to specific projects. And last but certainly not least, again, loan capacity is primarily driven by capitalization. So if we want to increase the loan capacity of either SRF programs, then in order to do that in a meaningful way, that means more capital has to be put into the program at the end of the day. So go to the next slide. Just a quick slide to remind people about our schedule. So as I say, we'll start developing next year's IUPs after the new year. And typically we hope to anyway, get back to a more normal schedule, which would put us posting a draft IUP about middle of April, having a board workshop or a webinar early May, and then comments due towards the end of May, and then hopefully going to the board for adoption at the second June board meeting. So go to the last slide. I think the last slide here. Yeah. So as I say, let's see, we're at 1:50, and so we're scheduled to run till 4 o'clock. Hopefully we'll get to all of your questions and have plenty of time for discussion today. But certainly, you know, if you don't think of questions or comments today, we're more than happy. We're very happy to hear those thoughts afterwards. And so please submit any questions or follow-up comments to the following mailboxes. This is just the normal mailbox. Nothing, it wasn't created specially for this. This is the normal mailbox where we take comments and questions regarding the SRF programs. For clean water SRF at waterboards.ca.gov, and drinking water, very similar, drinking water SRF at waterboards.ca.gov. And the other thing I want to give a quick shout out to is we've had an advisory group in the past. It's sort of become inactive, but we're trying to reactivate that here recently. We had our first official meeting a few weeks ago with an advisory group that we're trying to establish and reinvigorate. And so hopefully the folks that are on that we'll make it known that you can communicate through them as well. That's another avenue that we want to try to make use of in the future as far as giving advice to the SRF programs. I think that is the last slide there, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So I see there's a number of chat in there. I haven't really been paying all that much attention to, so I'm going to turn to staff there, and I see Bobby's got her hand raised. Why don't we take Bobby's question first, and then we'll kind of play it by ear as far as whether people want to raise their hand or go to the chat questions and take some of those. So Bobby, why don't you, I don't know, can you speak there, Bobby?
Oh, I can. Thank you, Christopher.
Yes.
And thank you for that very thorough overview. As many years as I've been doing this, I learned a few things today. So thank you for going through that. I have two questions and a comment/question. So I can just do one and come back after you've gotten to other people, or I can just do them all now, whatever you prefer.
I think go ahead there.
Okay. So my first question is, if the option were to fund no new projects in a 23-24, would that position you to then fund at the $600 million level the following year? And what would that accomplish, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, what it would accomplish, it would lower the average rate at which we're funding loans. But if you do the math, we'd have to stop for, I forget whether it was 3 or 4 years in order to actually get to an average of 600 million. And then the math is kind of wanky because it's hard to explain, but as I say, that's not really a viable option in my mind. That's just the quickest way mathematically to get to 600 million. And then after that, then the graph starts to go kind of weird. And so I wouldn't recommend that, to be frank with you.
Okay, that's helpful. My other question is, one of my concerns this year about establishing criteria to choose which projects to fund, which was what the direction that the board ended up going, is you're going to be evaluating applications that have been submitted in by December 31st, and the criteria for deciding which of those you're going to fund wouldn't be approved until April. And I guess I'm wondering, is there any fairness issue there? You have to have the complete application to score well. And again, maybe you have objective criteria that you would use, like it's a recycling project or it's this, but I would just be a little concerned about how applying that criteria sort of retroactively to applications, if there would be an opportunity for applicants to supplement or otherwise explain if they hadn't specifically articulated how they would meet that criteria in their application.
Yeah, I think you're right on there. That seems very unfair to me, and it runs counter to the whole idea of putting together a scoring system in the first place. It was there to try to make things predictable and understandable and transparent. So yeah.
Okay.
I agree with you.
Okay. And then my question comment is really not anything you can answer, but really seeing it laid out here so clearly with the 49% principal forgiveness and then the set asides, would we and it's a rhetorical question, you don't have to answer it, but wouldn't we as advocates be better off advocating instead of for all this money to keep going to the SRF when it's really not revolving, it's really not serving the purposes that we want it to serve, just to support separate grant programs or something instead of, because we all have this impression that a whole bunch of money went to the SRF when you're explaining to us, not really.
I can't make any recommendations as far as what you should advocate for.
That was a comment anyway, so thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yes. All right. Anybody else want to ask a live question, or we can go to the chat questions and make sure that we've answered those. Catherine.
Is this a section of questions just for questions, not for comments?
Questions or comments? Yeah, either one.
Okay, well then I will take the plunge into the hopefully clean water and tell you that my name's Catherine Dodd. I'm not an engineer, which it seems the department is dominated by. I'm a retired maternal child health nurse and environmental health advisor to families advocating for chemical and toxic safety. I'm sure you know, but it's worth repeating over and over and to keep it on a Post-it on your computer screen that there is no safe level of lead exposure. You said we were talking about the VIL and the effect of California's ability to provide loans. I have a much better understanding of how there's this big amount of money and then all of a sudden there's very little. The money that we have, though, from the VIL is a one-time gift from the federal government, and many of us worked very hard to get that passed. You keep mentioning stakeholders, and the stakeholders I represent are families and health professionals, and we expect you to recommend to the board how to make the best use of that money. That means doing everything possible to ensure that you remember the statement, there are no safe lead exposures. No safe lead exposures. It's the most important thing you will do in your career. It will change hundreds of lives. So with that premise, I'd like you to prioritize funding projects that will ensure the strictest, better than the minimum EPA standards, the strictest requirements for safety. Accurately and thoroughly establish inventories with all sources of possible and lead, known and unknown. This is essential so we know what needs to be replaced. How can you fix something if you don't know where it's damaged? Remove all possible sources of lead exposure after establishing and monitoring public health protections, including notification in multiple languages, testing, monitoring, and providing filters. Accurate inventories and definitions must include lead pipes, anything soldered with lead, goosenecks, pigtails, or other connections, galvanized lines in general, because they contain 3% lead, regardless of whether they're what's upstream. Inventory must be completed whenever the water is disturbed. What health protections are being provided, pre and post testing, notification, and filtering, all of that needs to be in the inventory. We can't prioritize unless we know what we have. And since the Department of Drinking Water has allowed replacements and may well still be doing it without permits with all this information, it's essential that we have inventory. And lastly, as far as loans go, it's essential to prioritize replacements on the private side in disadvantaged communities without requiring upfront funding and providing technical assistance to those communities and water systems, because filling out 140-page applications is absurd. So I'll leave it at that. I will continue to advocate for federal funds for safe drinking water, but I hope you spend it the right way. Do it right the first time. Don't just do the minimum that's expected. We are known for being a state that's healthy, and it's a shame that we've allowed replacements to occur without notification. And we have no idea where they are, how many there are. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your comments, and I appreciate you coming today. Susan Little, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to just jump in and just support Catherine's comments, which were very helpful. And just to reiterate that, we have been talking with the board quite a bit about these issues, but just again, to go on record to say that we just, as part of the IUP processes, we really want to see the board establish clear and transparent written policies that will require water systems or third-party contractors, when they're using these funds, to do full inventories of both galvanized and lead goosenecks pipes on both the customer and the utility side of the line, as well as all lead pipes and goosenecks. provide notice filters and water testing whenever they're removing or disturbing lead or galvanized lines or goosenecks as part of these projects. Disturbing me, I would define that as being how the EPA defines it in the lead and copper rule revisions, which is anytime water is turned off to do repairs. Also, these policies should clearly require the removal of full lead and or galvanized lines or gooseneck removals, even if the galvanized lines were, but no longer are, downstream of lead goosenecks. And of course, ensure that customer sideline removals are fully funded, as Catherine mentioned. And ideally, we want the Water Board to really establish broad-based regulations imposing these requirements on all this activity. And we'll continue to discuss that with you and appreciate your time today.
Again, thank you for your comments and thanks for coming today. I don't see any other hands, so I don't know, staff, any questions in the chat that we want to address?
Sure, Christopher, would it help if I read a few from earlier? I'll just read them out loud so everyone can follow along.
Yeah.
So this is a question from Bobby Larson. What is the percentage of the state is required to dedicate to principal forgiveness? Can an equivalent level of subsidization be achieved with very low interest rates and longer loan terms?
So the requirements for loan forgiveness vary a little bit by the grant. And so, sorry for the, in general for the Clean Water SRF, it has been 40% has gone to loan forgiveness. For the Drinking Water SRF, the number is, I believe, 49% in general. Josh can correct me if I'm misstating this, but there are other percentages that have been established in the bill. There were some of the grants that were established at for the Clean Water SRF. Some of the money was also established at 49%. Some of it for the emerging contaminants was 100% loan forgiveness. And so it varies depending upon the specific pot of money. So one has to really look at those in detail to see the exact percentages. To answer your second part of your question, which I believe is the more critical part of your question, is can that same level of subsidy be achieved by changing the loan terms? And the answer to that question is no. Both the Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act, I believe, make it very clear that giving 0% loans or doing those sorts of things that you're suggesting are not the equivalent. So Congress has mandated that we provide those percentages as loan forgiveness.
And Josh Zeese chimed in, maybe one important thing to note is that there is a minimum and maximum amount that the states must administer as principal forgiveness. And California has historically chosen the maximum amount of principal forgiveness. And one of the key eligible entities for principal forgiveness are disadvantaged communities.
Yes, that is an excellent point. So there is some flexibility for the states to not provide the maximum principal forgiveness there. But historically, California has not done that.
Already a question from Michael Sharp again on principal forgiveness. So now that we've talked more about it, maybe it answered part of it, but he had asked, when we receive money for principal forgiveness, is that money for California forgiving loans to others and we lose the interest, or California loans from California loans from others being forgiven and we no longer have to pay, but it does not increase our current cash flow?
Say that question one more time.
Is the principal forgiveness forgiving, are we forgiving others loans, or are our own loans being forgiven? And I think the answer is that we are forgiving loans for agencies, recipients to do their projects. Essentially, the money acts as a grant in that case.
Yes, exactly. So if we're providing a $1 million loan to a local water district or a local sewer district, and it's loan forgiveness, then they don't have to pay that $1 million loan back to us. So that, as I said earlier, that money is gone. That doesn't stay. Once it's loaned out and it's not repaid, we can't loan it out again. We can only loan out what is, again, what has been repaid to us.
Alexandra Ganell asked, is there a new sustainable loan capacity now with Bill?
Sorry that if you're not speaking, can you put yourself on mute there? I think Daphne, I think you might have a hot mic there. I'm sorry, go ahead with that question again, Mike.
The question was, is there a new sustainable loan capacity number now that Bill has passed?
So we did look at a number of different scenarios, given what happened with the bipartisan infrastructure law. I talked about not only the appropriations, but as well as the authorizations and the potential that might increase future appropriations. So we did look at that and run those different scenarios with our financial advisor. And given what happened with the budget this year, and therefore what that implies for future years, we did update that. It might have made a small difference in the loan capacity for both programs, but it was not enough to where we felt it was a good idea to go ahead and change what we published in the IUP for this year. But we will update our capacity calculation next year, and we do that as a part of a normal part of the normal intended use plan process. So we will keep updating that. But again, barring some radical increase in capitalization to either program, not expecting that to change radically. But we'll take a look at it every year and update it as we go along as appropriate.
I'm gonna read another one, and I'll mention that if you want to read your own question, feel free to raise your hand. So this question is, can you prioritize based on need and alternatives available? A wealthier community, for example, might be able to rely on other lending sources with higher rates than a less wealthy or economically disadvantaged community. Maybe more of a comment.
Well, yeah, there's also a question. Can the board do that? Yes, the board can do that. And so I'll take that opportunity as a springboard to talk about, we are working on updating the both policies that govern the operation of the SRF programs. There's a policy for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. There's a policy for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And so as both of those, that is part of the guidelines, the guidance that the board gives us for how we score and rank projects. So that's something that we're looking at, and that can be updated. We on average update those policies about every 2 to 3 years historically. And so yeah, that's definitely a question that we'll be looking at as part of the policy there. As I noted earlier, there are 6 or 7 years of projects waiting for financing. The reality is that many of those projects probably will have to go get financing somewhere else, just because of the nature of the capacity of the SRF programs. And so what the scoring and ranking systems are intended to do is to make it clear to folks, well, what projects are likely to get funded, and then if you are, if you have a project that fits into those criteria that is going to score high, well, then, you can focus your energy on that, and you at least have that clarity of knowing that, this project stands a decent chance of getting SRF funding. These don't. And so I'm going to have to look at alternatives for those other projects. I mean, that's really the motivation for having that sort of a system in place.
What options do we have as stakeholders to stay involved with future IUP developments, especially over these next 5 years? And will DFA be doing these outreaches every year?
We have historically had workshops, stakeholder workshops as part of the development process. You're more than welcome to submit comments to us at any time. I mean, there's no deadline for that. As I noted, we'll be working on the policy amendment, and part of that will be a stakeholder workshop to get some feedback on that. I also noted the advisory group, and so I don't want to put any of those folks on the spot there, but the members of that will be reaching out to their membership. And CASA and Water Reuse are on that, and other groups as well are represented on that advisory group. So they'll be doing their own sorts of outreach to their members. So yeah, lots of different avenues to give us feedback.
I'll add that you may have found out about this listening session being part of a LIRIS email list. If you got it some other way, we do have that LIRIS email list for both SRF programs that you can subscribe to, and that way, whenever we have workshops or other public meetings, you would get notice of those.
So, Mike, maybe you could go back to the previous slide there and just leave the email addresses. Like I say, those are email addresses. That's our standard email address. So we get all sorts of different information through those email addresses. At any time, feel free to send us comments or information that you think that you think we ought to hear.
I'm going to combine two questions. Who determines who is on the advisory group, part of the advisory group, and when will the advisory group meet again?
The next advisory group is going to be December 16th. And it's somewhat of an informal group. There's no one that has decided that somebody is or isn't on the group there. And so we've mostly at this point identified folks that represent various stakeholders to the program. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but there are probably half a dozen different at this point. If you're interested in finding out more about that, like I say, I'd send an email to one of those email addresses there, and we'll be happy to get back to you.
All right, we have a question. They applied for the fiscal year 2022-23 and were included in the comprehensive list of projects with priority scores. I believe we don't need to apply again, and it will remain on the comprehensive list and eventually will make it to the fundable list. Would you clarify?
So the first part of your question, yes, you will remain on the comprehensive list. I don't know what your score is, so as to whether you will ultimately get onto the fundable list, I can't say that for certain. That will depend on, because the fundable list, the cutoff score for the fundable list does vary over the years. It has ranged from, I think, 12 to 14. I may be wrong on the exact numbers there, but it hasn't been the same every year. The cutoff score is driven by that sustainable funding target and how many projects score at each score level. The maximum score is 16, and so it really depends on that calculation. So again, I'm not making any predictions because I don't know what your score was, but it's within the realm of possibility that your score is never high enough to get on the fundable list.
If you've submitted an application, you should have been assigned a project manager here in Division of Financial Assistance. And so if you want to follow up with specific project questions, please feel free to do so. We should be able to address your project specific need. I think this could, use some more principal forgiveness clarification. So the comment is principal forgiveness only applies to past loans. Can principal forgiveness be implemented proactively? So an entity seeking to borrow $1 million, for example, can have $200,000 forgiven at approval and only pay back $800,000 over the term.
So let me clarify that principal forgiveness is not loan forgiveness in the sense of you already have a loan and we come in and provide you loan forgiveness. Loan forgiveness is for new loans. So that's the way it is provided, is for projects that are getting financing from us now. Then yes, they, in many cases, they will get 100% of the loan forgiven. In some cases, yeah, it is a combination of loan forgiveness and loan, but yeah, let me clarify this. We're not forgiving a loan or some bonds that you issued 10 years ago or something like that.
Please feel free to raise hands. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep charging through here. Can you elaborate on the SRF base funding available versus what was appropriated? Is there any estimate for what SRF base program funding will be available in the coming IUP?
So the base program, so how I interpret that term, just to clarify things. So the base program, we're not taking into consideration the money for emerging contaminants or for lead service lines. So that, when I speak about the base program, that's what I'm talking about. So there was some money that was appropriated for any eligible project. And so that's synonymous in my mind with the base program that was appropriated by the bipartisan infrastructure law. And then every year Congress does a budget and it appropriates, it has for both programs, no guarantee that it would appropriate any money in the future for the SRF programs, but it has historically done so. And so we're expecting that additional funds will be appropriated each year. And so to give you a dollar amount, I'm not sure I have the dollars at my fingertips there. But I think it would be the numbers that I previously went over in one of those slides. Well, that would be just the loan portion. So yeah, so send us an email and we'll do some calculations for you and get back to you on that. I can't do the math on my head here.
They actually have their hand raised right now, so maybe they can follow up with that question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, go ahead.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate you having this session today. My question is really kind of related back to making sure I'm understanding one of the slides. There was a few earlier. I don't know if it's possible to go back to there where it seemed to be when in your key takeaways slide, sorry. Or take home messages there, the statement that the appropriations for clean water SRF base program were less than authorized, around 30% of what was authorized. So I think what you're saying is when the appropriations were made, it was only 30% of what was originally anticipated? Or what do we mean when we say authorized there?
So Mike, if you can go back to the slide that shows, yeah, that slide. So you have to understand a little bit about how Congress does its budget. And so it first authorizes a certain amount of money for a program, but then every year it appropriates a certain amount of money. So what's authorized for the clean water SRF and the drinking water SRF for this 5-year period, 2022 to 2026, is 1.5 billion for the clean water SRF and 1.7 billion for the drinking water SRF. That's how much they could appropriate.
Okay.
But they only appropriated this year, and so you divide that by 5 basically. So they could have appropriated $300 million for the clean water SRF this year, but they only appropriated a little over $100 million.
And
so that, if you
can I ask
extrapolate
you a
that out,
follow-up?
then if you extrapolate that out, that's where you get the 468 and the 355.
I see. And as a follow-up, then can I ask, when was that appropriation actually made then that was only $100 million in this past year?
Congress approved the budget in what, March or something like that?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, as a stakeholder, most of the public literature that was out there was all about how much money the SRF program was getting, and it really seemed like it was advertising like, wow, there's going to be a lot of money. And you know, as a stakeholder, hearing those messages combined with the message that, oh, the IUP draft is going to come out late this year, you know, we kept hearing it was going to come out later and later and later. It really sounded like it was because you had so much money, you hardly knew what to do with it. I mean, it's a bit of a joke, I know, but that's kind of the impression that we were getting. So then when things came out like it did, it was, you know, a double whammy shock, because it seemed like it was going just to counter. And unfortunately, all this happened to coincide with a historic rise in bond rates at the same time. So for the stakeholders who had scores of 13, who were expecting most likely to see good news, it was a real double whammy to be surprised on that and then discover that over the course of time that we waited for the delays in the IUP to have it come out, and, you know, rates went up so much that, you know, the bonding prices to try to go out and finance our projects that way was quite difficult to swallow. So anyway, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, so sorry, I'm probably rambling a bit. I guess the key question from all that would be, is in this coming year, what are the chances that the draft IUP is actually going to come out in May? For those of us who, you know, really need to make decisions about how we're going to try to fund things and keep our projects moving.
Oh, I think there's a good chance that we'll get back to our more normal schedule. You know, I could see some delay, you know, but a lot of it, again, was not just, well, we got more money, we also got more money for new things that we had to do. So the lead service line and emerging contaminants. So, you know, you saw additional IUPs that had to be created from scratch for these additional pots of money. And we also got quite a bit of extra money through the state budget, general fund appropriations last year, as well as this year. You know, there was amendments to both IUPs in March of this year related to that additional appropriations. So yeah, there was quite a bit going on there, and that, yeah, I hear what you're saying about being caught off guard a little bit by that. But now we've got you know, we've got something established there, and we can build on that. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get back to a more normal schedule for that.
Okay. And I'm sure we'd all like to be able to guess what Congress's appropriations for the base SRF program would be next year, huh?
Well, you know, it was everybody was excited by those headline numbers, and it really took a lot of time to dive down into those. And like I say, Congress didn't make the final budget until March, so that contributed to, you know, to this. you know, so, you know, it was nice. And so hopefully somebody got some benefit out of those headline numbers, but we had to go by the actual numbers as far as what we put into the IUP.
Thank you. Appreciate the feedback.
You're welcome.
Christopher, what is the timeline for updating the policy this time around?
So we're shooting for taking a policy amendment to the board in June of next year, alongside of the IUPs.
Thanks. You want to call on, go ahead and call on Eric?
Oh, yeah. Go
Thanks,
ahead.
Mike. Thanks so much, Christopher, for this presentation. I found it really helpful. And so I don't know if I have a lot of questions, given a lot of sort of the issues that Community Water Center submitted as part of our letter to this year's Drinking Water SRF intended use plan was around sort of issues separate from the lending capacities of the program. So just wanted to just make some notes here in terms of just sharing sort of some of the priorities that we're continuing to think about and helping to continue the conversation moving forward. So I just wanted to flag that as part of our comment letter, we submitted sort of some comments around the metrics for the Drinking Water SRF program. And really a lot of that came from our one hope that funding is reaching communities faster, and two, reaching the communities that really need the support the most. And so while I know the conversation today isn't largely focused on that, we're still continuing to want to have that as a priority and would love to continue to perhaps in some of the stakeholder advisory groups talk through some of those items as well. So that's a definite priority for us. The next priority for CWC is around being creative for how we use the SRF to address affordability challenges for communities. And so definitely the SRF program is addressing affordability, but I think for us, we're hoping to just begin thinking more broadly, more creatively around how this program could really address affordability on the ratepayer side of things. So that's another comment. And then lastly, just wanted to note that we're really looking forward to the policy document coming out as well. And so, yeah, looking forward to seeing that open for comment, hopefully soon.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for your comments. Appreciate you coming today. Oh, let's see, Cam. I see your hand up there. How you doing, Cam?
I'm good, Christopher. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Start my video so people can see me. Hey, thank you very much for this. It's an excellent presentation. It's really clear. And I'm curious about, first on the policy coming out that you mentioned that's going to be around June. There's going to be a public comment period on that before it comes out in June, or should we?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
We'll go through
All right.
public comment.
All right, so I'll just look out for that. The second is on this 30% of authorized numbers in the appropriation. It's just a comment in general. That's really low. I mean, I know it's not on you by any means, but and that just a suggestion to everybody on this call that that's the type of thing that we could probably affect at various different levels. I mean, if our representatives are in Congress only appropriating 30% of the state, the state revolving fund authorized, that's not good. And my suggestion would be for us as a group to start thinking about how we each benefit from higher appropriations, and I think that would solve a lot of this problem. My third question is on the principal forgiveness. I think it's on the next chart. I'm curious about why that's not included in amounts you can give out. So the way I understand it is that you can only lend a certain amount because only a certain amount's going in the state revolving fund. But the way the principal forgiveness was explained, or at least the way I understood it, is that if it's available to folks who are now applying for loans and then applied to their loans that are going forward, wouldn't you then include that in the amount that you're able to give out in a given year? Or
yes, it goes out in a given year. But like I say, I was focusing mainly on what affects the loan capacity, which is a long-term over and over again capacity there. So yeah, there's definitely quite a bit of principal forgiveness that's available to us from the bipartisan infrastructure law. So yeah, that is going to go out on a year-by-year basis as we receive it as part of the capitalization grants.
Okay.
But it's not going to contribute in the long term to making loans, because it only goes out once and then it doesn't come back.
All right.
That makes
Great.
sense.
Thank you. It does. I'm curious whether or not you have to, if you have to put it all out in the year it was appropriated and in the year it comes in, or if you can stagger the amounts over a period of years in order to kind of spread the benefit out wider.
EPA's guidance is that we should only have 2 cap grants open at any one time. So that roughly translates to us committing the money in 2 years and dispersing it.
Okay.
So just to give a little bit more context to this 30% that was appropriated, a little bit more background for you all. So what happened with the appropriations for the SRF programs this year, the budget appropriations, is they were essentially the same as what was appropriated the previous year. So the 30% comes from the fact that they upped the authorization amount so that the resulting number was, this is 30% of what's authorized. It wasn't that they didn't necessarily cut anything, it's they increased the denominator there, but they kept the numerator the same. And then, like I say, on top of that, they kept the numerator the same. And then on top of that, they directed some of that numerator to specific projects that were named. Go ahead, Mike.
Christopher, can you restate the length of time it is going to take to get a loan?
Restate the length of time that's going to take to get a loan. Well, that varies. Probably typically anywhere from 6 to 18 months is probably a rough approximation, is where we're running at this point.
Is the SRF advisory group balanced between industry and consumers?
I don't think we have any consumer group representatives on there, to be candid with you at this point. So it's mostly folks that represent applicants to the SRF programs at this point, I think.
Is the 6 to 7 year project funding wait just for the fundable list projects? Are the wait times different between clean water and drinking water SRF? And is that information available somewhere publicly so local agencies know where they may fall in the queue or have the ability to find this information?
So multi-part question there. So say the first part of the question again.
Yeah, the 6 to 7 year project funding wait time. And I think that's more looking at probably the demand on the program. Yeah, I'm missing it somehow.
Yeah, so, and this I think kind of goes back to an earlier question that somebody asked about being on the comprehensive list, and eventually they'll get on the fundable list. Well, I don't think it's quite that simple. So there are folks that are going to be submitting new applications, and so it isn't that if you wait 6 years that you're automatically going to get on the fundable list. We're going to evaluate and score applications on a year-by-year basis. And so that just because you've submitted an application doesn't automatically create a place in line for you. It's really driven by the scoring system for the Clean Water SRF and the ranking system for the drinking water SRF. And so there's no guarantee that just because you're on the comprehensive list that you will get on the fundable list. And so how does one figure that out? Well, you can certainly call us and talk to us. Mike, recommended that if you are on the comprehensive list, that then you've been assigned a project manager, and you can certainly discuss that and get more insight as to where you are and what possibilities are for next year's fundable list or the following year's fundable list, what you can do to increase your score. Just because you submit an application doesn't mean that you can't improve that application and improve your score. That's the answer to the first part of the question. What was the second part again?
Part of it was, are wait times different between clean water and drinking water SRF?
They're probably fairly similar. I don't know that we've ever looked at that per se. That's just kind of my general sense of it. One thing I will say that is different, again, as it relates to small disadvantaged communities, they go through a different process, so they can submit an application at any time and get on the fundable list at any time. That's mostly driven by their ability to submit a complete application. Many of them, have challenges with doing that, and we provide a lot of technical assistance to those sorts of communities to help them, get prepared and do the legwork that's necessary to have a complete application. And so there's a wide variety of challenges that they have, and so consequently there's a wide variety of timeframes that it takes them to get to that point of having a complete application. It's hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer to that.
With quite a bit of evidence that wildfire risk management can protect water quality and augment water quantity, would the board consider watershed protection projects with a relevant utility applicant? There are individual projects that cost well over $100 million. How might we have those projects considered?
Yeah, those projects could be eligible, and so it really one of the keys there is having a source of revenue for a loan. And so, yeah, they're either for the clean water or drinking water SRF. There are potential funding opportunities there.
It was mentioned earlier that technical assistance allowances are used and taken out of the revolving program. What are the limitations on how those technical assistance allowances are appropriated or used, I believe is the question.
That is a very complicated question, which I'm not going to try to answer on the fly here. So what I would ask you to do, whoever was asking that question, is send an email to either the drinking water SRF or the clean water SRF at waterboards.ca.gov. Send us your contact information, and we will try to set something up to give you some more insight into that. That is a very complex question.
Maybe related is another question. What's included in set-asides?
Okay, that's a bit easier to answer. So the technical name on the clean water SRF is not set-asides, but for just colloquially, there is, you can spend some of the money for administration, and you can spend some of the money for technical assistance. And for the drinking water SRF program, I'm going to try to remember all of the different set-asides here, but there's an administrative set-aside, there's a small water system set-aside, there is a public water system supervision set-aside, and there's a capacity development set aside. I think I remembered them all. Josh, did I miss any?
The only few ones I would add, we also have a source water protection set aside and a wellhead protection program set aside.
Okay.
And then that we can also use it to help implement.
You cut out there at the very end.
Oh, we can also use the set asides to implement an operator certification program.
Gotcha. Okay, next question, Mike.
Can you clarify loan time of 6 to 18 months? From what point? Submission of all 4 application packages, from time project is moved to fundable list and list is approved, or some other time?
Yeah, I would consider that when we receive a complete application, bearing in mind that we can't execute an agreement before somebody gets on the fundable list. So that has to be taken into consideration as well. I mean, we will and historically have started reviewing applications before they get on the fundable list, with some belief based either on their score or their rank that they will get on the fundable list. So it's mainly from when we get a complete application is when that kind of time frame starts.
I was just going to say I was out of chats, but here is a couple more. Were wastewater consolidation projects added to the fundable list, or are these still subject to the rank and scoring? Local agencies seem to understand that this BIP, not sure if BIP is set aside guaranteed funding for wastewater consolidation projects simply by submitting an application.
Well, when you say wastewater consolidation, just to clarify, that could mean a couple of things. Certainly, there was money appropriated in general fund appropriation in last year for wastewater, $650 million. One of the things was to prioritize septic to sewer, and so that could, some people might consider that a consolidation. If you're talking about 2 systems joining together, which is less common in my mind, more common on the drinking water side, that systems physically get connected together. Either there's an outright consolidation and a merger, or maybe an intertie, something like that. That's fairly common on the drinking water side. I suppose that there could be wastewater systems that do combine into one system. But when I think of those situations, I most often think of small disadvantaged communities. And so again, that has less to do with the scoring on the clean water side and more to do with that pathway of getting a complete application. So I'm not totally sure I answered your question there, but those are the thoughts that come to mind. If I didn't answer your question, certainly put more in the chat there.
Regarding the small water system set aside, are only DACs eligible for those?
I'll let you tackle that one, Josh. You're on mute there.
Sorry. Per the federal rules, the small water system technical assistance set aside is not limited to solely disadvantaged communities. And more specifically, small water systems on the federal rules is defined as less than 10,000 people. Now, we have been using that set aside for several years now, and it predominantly funds staff within our Office of Sustainable Water Systems who are prioritized by the board to help small water systems and give TA. And they are prioritizing disadvantaged community small water systems. So just to clarify again, it's the federal rules doesn't limit it to disadvantaged communities, but the board is currently using it to fund its staff in providing technical assistance to small water system disadvantaged communities, because that's where the need and focus of Office of Sustainable Water Systems is right now.
And in case it needs to be said that public agencies aren't applying to the set-asides for funding of their project. Those set-asides are meant for the states to use, like Josh said, for staff or contracts or other ways to accomplish the goals of the Safe Drinking Water Act. What are the interest rates right now on each type of loan? Thinking the clean water and drinking water.
So clean water is 2.1% is the most recent that I saw.
I think it's 2.6 actually.
Oh, okay, I stand corrected. 2.6. I don't recall off the top of my head what the drinking water SRF is currently.
I believe it is 1.1, but before you get your hopes up, that will be recalculated. Drinking water interest rate is calculated differently, so that will be recalculated for all of the 2023 year, starting January 1st. So if you haven't applied or you don't complete application, you will probably be under the 2023 interest rate, at which I think we're estimating it would be an average, it gets averaged out and it would be 2.1, something around there. Can loans fund planning and design of projects?
Hypothetically, yes. For clean water SRF, and again, it depends on if you're a small disadvantaged community, then we very often provide loan forgiveness or grant for planning and design for those communities. If you're talking about strictly a loan, then again, hypothetically, yes. For the clean water SRF, part of the scoring system is your readiness to proceed to construction. So that's often kind of a make or break part of the scoring process. Or that's been our experience over the last 4 years that the scoring system has been in place. So as a practical matter, it's probably not going to make sense for you to submit a loan application for clean water SRF just for planning and design. You can get reimbursed for the cost of planning and design as part of a clean water SRF loan. But drinking water SRF is not part of the scoring system per se. But again, there's quite a bit of demand. So submitting an application just for planning and design is probably, I would focus on, getting a construction loan, and then part of that budget can be the cost that you spent on planning and design and get reimbursed for those. Alexandra, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, Christopher and team. Can you guys hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. And my camera's not working, so I won't show myself. But first of all, I just want to thank you all so much for taking the time to do this. I think this is very helpful in advance of coming out with next year's draft IUP to help us better understand what you're considering and what you're grappling with. I think those of us who were looking at this year's IUP, as you guys noted and others have noted, we're really surprised, and that was really challenging, I think, for everyone, you, I'm sure, included, to really work through. So having this sort of thought sharing process and foreshadowing some of the things that you guys are dealing with is very helpful, and I appreciate that. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask that if you all are thinking about, it sounds like, making policy changes, and you are thinking that those are going to be substantial policy changes around scoring, ranking, those sorts of things, criteria, approach to how you're prioritizing. If at all possible, if you could have something similar like this in advance of publishing that draft policy, so that we could see kind of what you're considering and some challenges and do some thought sharing around that, that would be appreciated. And I know it takes it away from the time of actually doing the work to draft these revisions and review all these applications, to take time away to do a session like this. But I really do think it's helpful for all of us to understand your objectives and challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's our intent to do that. We want to talk to DDW and the regional boards, and we've on the clean water scoring system. This, I believe, is the 4th year that we've done scoring. So we've got, I believe, this was my expectation when we first put it in place, is okay, we get some experience with it and then see how it's working out. I've asked staff to take a look at what scoring has been done up to this point and how, what factors have played a role in the scoring. I suspect that there are some factors that may not even be used. I don't know. That's what we need to look at and really get a better sense of, is it, what is producing the results, and are those the results that we want? That's the engineer in me, is you get it drummed into your head of, okay, you do all these calculations, and if you were expecting a number of 10, but you get 100, well, you probably did something wrong along the way. So you gotta go back and look at your methodology. And so that's what we're in the process of doing, is looking at that methodology and evaluating, is it producing the results that we want it to produce?
Thank you. And similarly, I think, not just Clean Water SRF, though I know that is where you really are, most oversubscribed, but if you're also looking at and opening up that ranking and scoring for drinking water, any sort of advanced thought sharing you all could do on that with the stakeholders, I think would be really helpful. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Now, I'll take this opportunity to also share that, with the bill funding that Christopher talked about, it required, new IUPs and new fundable lists. These are EPA requirements that are part of SRF programs and SRF capitalization grants. So there are separate fundable lists for both lead service line replacement projects and emerging contaminant projects. So, separate from the base program, Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF fundable lists that most of you are, more familiar with. We're out of questions in the chat, so anyone can feel free to type something in or raise your hand. And I probably should have left it on this slide a little longer, maybe to help encourage thoughts on potential options for a future IUP.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Alexandra.
I'll just say thank you for, again, brainstorming some of these. It sounded like some, you felt like might be a little more challenging than others, such as no new projects and prioritizing kind of, and then having that priority criteria be retroactive. So it sounds like you were seeing some challenges with those. As far as I think that the capping, I think you guys have done that. Just my feedback on that is that I feel like whatever route you go, whether it's changing the cutoff score or putting a cap on an agency amount or on a project amount, I think knowing some level of consistency over more than just 1 year. So, you know, if you guys were to say, you know, we can't completely know what our appropriations are going to be in the next 5 years, but if we use this anticipated amount, we think that we probably won't fund projects, you know, more than X amount of dollars, you know, per one project, or no more than X amount of dollars per agency. And that's going to be in place for the next 3 years. And the reason why I say something like that, and I'm not necessarily advocating for it, I'm just advocating for maybe kind of a longer vision of whatever your mitigation strategy is going to be, is that I think many of us plan multiple years in advance. You know, we know probably what's on our CIP. We know which ones might be good candidates based on your existing approach. And when the approach might change year to year, then, you know, we've already probably started investing in what we think are going to be our candidate projects for the next couple of years. And so, yeah, I just think that kind of knowing and a level of predictability around what the approach is going to be could be helpful for those of us who are looking at our large CIPs and figuring out what is the best fit for your program.
Right. Yeah.
Can I ask a question back to Alexandra on the subject of maximums? Is there any benefit to maximums per agency versus maximums per project?
I feel like this is a tough question, Mike, because I don't want to paint myself into a place where we know that we wouldn't have, you know, we couldn't have an opportunity. But I do feel like, you know, that the program is constrained, and we're all going to have to, you know, we're all going to have to give a little bit. So I think, you know, per agency could be one approach, per project could be one approach. I think there's pros and cons to both. But what I think, and we've talked about this, gives me anxiety a little bit some years, is that I don't know whether it's going to be a percentage cap. I don't know what that percentage is going to be. Is it going to be, you know, per project? So I just don't have any predictability around it. And so I think that's it. So I would welcome others to also weigh in on what they think the pros and cons are of a per agency or per project cap. I haven't thoroughly thought that through, but I could see that there would be benefits and challenges to both approaches. Maybe Bobby has thoughts if she's still on.
Mike McCullough said project maximum versus agency maximum. That was his 2 cents.
Thanks, Mike.
And I'll just jump in and say I don't have specific thoughts yet, but I would definitely like to put my head together with Jared and some other folks and maybe email you some thoughts that we might have collectively. I hadn't really thought about those specific questions until just now. So
I kind of thought, you know, food for thought might be, you know, hearing you speak, Alexandra, that there's quite a bit of decision making that goes into applying for an SRF loan and all the SRF requirements. And so if you had to apply the SRF requirements to every project to get partial funding, does it make more sense to apply them to one project and get more funding for that project? So that's kind of the thinking.
That is true. Yes, I would say that rather than having partial funding on 10 projects, it's easier to have full funding on one. Yeah.
I suppose the flip side of that is if you put all your eggs in one basket and then that basket, you know, doesn't get selected. Go ahead, Bob.
So I was just going to say that, you know, going back in time, we used to have a cap, but we would fund a project at any level pretty much, but the cap was really on a disbursement basis per year.
Yeah.
You know, you could only take disbursements of X amount of dollars in a year. That way we weren't really restraining you on the project size. But since we operate on a cash flow, that may help everybody out in some other ways. That's how we funded, Orange County Water District at the start.
Right. Right. Good point.
The question from the chat. My project score was 12 at the time of application last year. Now it is has a score of 13. However, regardless of scoring, no new projects will make it on the fiscal year 2023-24 fundable list, correct?
Well, that hasn't been decided at this point. That's part of the reason for having this listening session, is to get some feedback on, in light of what happened this year, what ought to happen next year. So no decisions have been made at this point regarding next year's IUP. So Mike, if you could just put that email address slide up there, just as everyone leaves, they can be reminded of the email addresses there. I think they're pretty easy to remember, but just as a reminder there. Thank you, everyone. You have a good weekend, and you all have a good Thanksgiving as well.